Most of the original manuscripts of Pierre Corneille were destroyed. The family china, methodically smashed, plate by plate, by the child Johann Wolfgang Goethe in the backyard of his paternal home. Later, in the house of the hostess in Leipzig, he burns poems brought back from Frankfurt. Le Sac Amoureuse, a literary work by Claire C., published without the author's name, designed by the architect Sir Joseph Paxton for London's Great Exhibition of 1851. The monumental glass structure of the Crystal Palace was destroyed by fire on November 30th, 1936, shortly after a visit by Samuel Beckett. Oils on wood by the painter Henri Lefebvre, cut into strips, then nailed to strengthen the framework of more recent works. The Other Voice by Gozo Yoshimashu. Some verses are missing between Silent Lips and We, the Color, on page 15, beginning from line 8. Quote, "The whole poem is lost, that before was in my neurons, quickly written some moments ago." End quote. Nelson Asher. Before publishing his first book, Henri de Luca wrote a page every morning that he would tear up that evening. Quote, "We're all nameless, incomplete." End quote. Victor Serge. The top of Constantine Brancusi's column at Targu Giu. Power, a picture made of glass by Catherine White. The artist mistakenly walks on the piece in front of her, breaks the surface, and passes through. Quote, "I've retained an important symbolic trace from this episode." End quote. As part of an exhibition called Land's End, the artist Bastian Adder decides to cross the Atlantic solo from Cape Cod and disappears forever.
Hey listeners, this is Nick, and you're listening to another episode of the Books of Some Substance podcast. Today I'm joined by Tom Comitta, aficionado of citational fiction and author of The Nature Book, newly released and available now from Coffeehouse Press. Tom selected Henri Lefebvre's The Missing Pieces as the work of focus for today's discussion. So listen in as we talk through the history of authors remixing words, Lefebvre's ability to invoke emotion with lists, and the apparent popularity of the destruction of art in antiquity. Grab a copy, don't worry, it's a quick read, and stick around for the conversation. So perhaps as a starting point, I'm sure that many listeners have kind of heard some of these genre terms thrown around, things like found language, collage novels, supercuts, all of kind of under the umbrella of citational writing. But since you might very well be a good entry point for a lot of listeners, can you help to define just those terms and genres?
Yeah, so, early on, as a person who is writing work that uses found language, particularly fiction that uses found language, I was curious, what is this history? And I found that probably the term most commonly used is the collage novel. But then when I got into it, I realized that term is a little confusing because there are like three potential definitions for it. One was used to describe the work of Max Ernst, particularly his like, they called them collage novels that were, like each page would be a visual collage of illustrations from like the 19th century and maybe earlier. And that would then include like maybe like a surreal line below each collage. And they were like book length, like novel length. And then later, people used the term to describe works that were like highly fragmentary. Like, one work that you guys have talked about on the show, Renata Adler's Speedboat, is described that way, particularly by David Shields, who also has made kind of collage novels himself. And even that, of course, famous like Reality Hunger that is also itself a collage. Then there's another definition. So there's the Max Ernst books, these fragmentary works, and then people also use it to describe books that are made entirely out of found language. And examples of that include like Graham Raoul's Woman's World, or in my research I found there's a lot more. And works of like William Burroughs like early on could be called that. I mean, not the novels, I guess, but his like shorter texts were completely found language in the cut-up era. So because this term was so complicated and confusing, I felt the need to kind of try to give some other vocabulary. And as you mentioned, there's this term I sometimes throw around, citational fiction. And it could just be citational writing. But basically anything that includes some amount of found language. And it could be like, usually it'd probably be more than your typical book, because a lot of books like might include a song lyric or something, like one or a few. But I'm talking about books that might be like 50% found language or more. And then another term that came up that actually was kind of like the main reason for my inquiry was looking for particularly works that were made entirely out of found language. I refer to those as literary supercuts. Mm-hmm. Of course, like referencing like YouTube supercuts. And yeah, those I've noticed they start early on, like earlier than you'd expect. Like the earliest literary supercut I've found is at the beginning of Moby Dick, where right before the narrative begins, there's like 13 pages of whale descriptions organized in chronological order from like Genesis up until the time of his writing. Mm-hmm. And when I found that, I was amazed. You know, I'd heard about this
whale stuff.
Yeah. And then 40 years later, Twain does this in his book, The American Claimant. He starts off with this disclaimer where he says there will be no weather in this book. Weather is like annoying to read. Nobody wants, it's not good for authors or readers. If you want weather, I've thrown some in the back of the book. And there you find like 8 descriptions of weather, including, once again, like some text from the Bible. And so, yeah. And then that practice really becomes big in the 60s. Like that's when you first see, the 50s and 60s is when you first see like works made entirely out of found language. Like these are parts of works that I just described. Mm-hmm. And of course there's been a lot since then. And then in the past 20 years, there's been particularly more, it seems, probably because of the, you know, in the poetry world, there was conceptual writing, which was a lot about that found language, creating found language works. But also I just think it was in the air, you know, like with the internet, we have like access to these massive archives potentially. And what do we do with them? How does writing respond to them?
So my initial impression of this before kind of understanding, you know, actually Moby Dick was one of the great references that you had made in that piece that you wrote for LitHub, where I was like, oh, that's actually what he was doing with that section. You know, it kind of clicked at that point. But my initial perception was sort of the, you know, post World War II sort of cut up Burroughs kind of thing, which having taken a spin through that, I sort of have exited that as I can't really read it. I don't know what I'm getting out of it and haven't really touched it since. So my question for you is, you know, with this spectrum of this type of writing out there, what does it actually give the reader as a format that regular types of fictional structures and narratives can't?
Yeah. So, you know, I think people do this for different reasons. Yeah, I mean, your example of the Melville and the Burroughs there are interesting because they're doing different things. Like Burroughs is intentionally making things disjointed. Melville is like creating a curated list that kind of tells a story. It's like a chronological story of how people have written about whales for like 2,000 years almost. Or actually more than 2,000 years. So yeah, I find the thing that is most exciting for me about this kind of work is that it can be a way to directly engage with like the materials, the physical, like actual words and materials of the past and either critique it by recontextualizing and maybe by pulling out ideological threads that are not as readily apparent, or and you know, making kind of new works and new meaning in the process. Like, I guess it's a process of recycling in some ways, but I've also thought it's kind of also maybe a cannibalization of these texts, depending on how you do it. And yeah, I found it just to be at this point, I just see it as a really great tool in the author's toolkit. One that is like stigmatized for usually being seen as plagiarism. But if you like wear, you know, your remix on your sleeve and you're honest about it and it's very clear you're critiquing something, like one, you're actually, you're making something that is not just like, I'm out to take somebody's words. You're also making something that allows, in my opinion, which I think is beautiful about this work, that the reader and you kind of become like co-researchers. You know, I also like some of this work where it's less curated even. Mm-hmm. And like the work we're going to talk about, it is an archive, and just surely the author has done a lot of research, but now we can do research. And I did, I looked up certain things. Yeah. So I don't know. I think they do a lot of things, but I'm very excited I feel like they kind of add some freshness and new ideas and conversations that wouldn't be possible otherwise.
Yeah. I liked your comparison to the internet and YouTube for the supercut terminology, because I think that becomes even more of an apt analogy when you realize how many things are being recut and remixed and just put together in different ways due to the fact that the internet is this massive archive. And this topic kind of came up with the Renata Adler book, Speedboat, in that it was sort of proto-Twitter. It was representative of maybe DJ culture. It was very fast to change direction. But that wasn't found language. That was, just her style directly. But I think when, trying to process how somebody who's grown up with the internet, who's perhaps younger than us, maybe views the world, I think of this style of writing as kind of new or different. And maybe that feeling isn't totally there if you've grown up in a culture that it is entirely cut up based. And so that, to me, there's a very obvious link that it's not that this is this thing that is necessarily evolving over time, not that it isn't, but rather that it's kind of like hitting a spot that fits very well culturally.
Yeah, I'm kind of fascinated. Like the reason that I wrote that essay that we've been referencing is that some experimental artists and writers really want to feel like they're so new and they're cutting edge or whatever. But on one hand, to be legitimized by the fiction world, I feel like I needed to show that it was, or to get somebody to actually publish me. I felt like I needed to show that there is precedent. You don't need to be so scared.
Yeah.
And we can get into that later. But yeah, I just think it's by finding this deep history, which I guess I didn't even mention, using found language in fiction, which I guess I will think about as fiction that is written down, because of course people have been sharing folk tales and for thousands of years, but it goes back as far as medieval Arabic literature. But then in nonfiction, there's this text, the Han Shu, from the 1st century AD, and that was a collection of this archive of found texts that was telling a history of the Han Dynasty in China. And then there's these commonplace books. So I just love the fact that this kind of writing actually is, and these commonplace books that were from ancient Rome and I believe even ancient Greece, that these methods have kind of been with us always, but that they have either been sidelined or forgotten, or of course seen as plagiarism. I think also that copyright wasn't really a thing until I believe it was the 1700s. And so you do have a lot of people just, Shakespeare, was known for using a lot of other people's actual words and these things. And also even Chaucer. So anyway, it was done a lot. It just once I read recently, once a British court in the 1700s decided that there needed to be this copyright thing, I think that it changed the conversation. Yeah, I guess that's why you need a term like this to distinguish it from works that are supposedly original. Although I would argue that, we're I just think originality is a kind of an uninteresting conversation just because I feel so much is drawing from everything else. I maybe have too far left of an opinion about copyright. I feel it feels weird to own words to me. But
well, actually, I am curious. What have you run into with the publishing of your book, regarding plagiarism and copyrights and all these legalities?
Yeah, so it was really an uphill battle to even get it accepted. That story is a little crazy because I just cold called Coffeehouse Press in 2017. I was giving a reading, hoping that they would come and hoping that they would then be we are interested in your work. And they did come and they did ask to consider it, which was amazing. But then I found out, I still needed to finish it, but I found out over a few years that they were worried about copyright, which is unsurprising. So eventually I finished the books And I did send them out to other agents just because I was curious what could happen. The agents and maybe a few other presses. No agent wanted to touch it because of copyright. And I had found out that Coffee House was concerned about it. So this essay that I wrote and the bibliography that I used to write it actually began as one, an interest in this history, and two, a way to show them like, look, here are hundreds of texts that do something similar. None of them have been sued. I did find there were 3 legal issues in 3 of them, but I did find about 100 fiction books that were made partially or entirely out of found language. So I made the bibliography. I wrote this essay. I sent it to Coffee House, and the next day they accepted the book. So basically, yeah. And the reason that all the agents said no is that there was this copyright concern, but and there were some funny responses too. Like people were like, "What the hell is this?" You know. So it was a little, in retrospect, it was a bit silly that I even tried that, I think, but I just didn't know. And just because this is not in the like art world, this is not a strange thing. If I published it as an art novel, people would be like, sure, like there are 15 other of these that we're aware of. But yeah, and the reason why I thought it was so strange is that there's this exception to copyright called fair use. That's the whole reason why I can do this, why Coffee House would have said yes. And it's an exception to copyright where there are like 4 or 5 categories that you have to meet, and that you like could be deemed, a fair use of infringing copyright. It says like basically like, yes, you're infringing copyright, but you're allowed to because of X, Y, and Z. Mm-hmm. And it's things like, does your work fundamentally transform the earlier text? Does it not infringe on others making that previous author or copyright holder making money? Is it the heart of the work? And there's one other. Anyway, so I closely followed these while I was writing it because I wanted the book to be published. But still, even with that, people are concerned because fair use is just a legal defense. Like somebody could still send me a cease and desist or sue me. And I don't know what would I really hope it does not happen. Like I've heard horror stories with like the band Negative Land being sued by U2 in the 90s. It sounds like it ruins people's lives. I don't want that. But, I had this idea for this book and it was the best idea I thought I had. So I just went forward and hope we'll see what happens.
I am impressed. You're one part author, one part academic researcher, one part legal scholar.
Yeah.
All wrapped up into one. So let's transition to the book you've selected to discuss.
Yeah.
So Missing Pieces by Henri Lefebvre. Yeah. One thing I just had to share my story when you recommended it. I told a couple people that, hey, we're going to read this thing by this old French Marxist philosopher. And this ends up factoring into the book. But the book is not by the old French Marxist philosopher. It is actually fairly recent. 2004 it came out in French. 2014 was the English translation. So since this is a fairly recent book, I'm curious, in your kind of exploration of citational fiction, where does this land in your process of experiencing stuff as a reader? Yeah.
Right. This book is interesting because we were previously talking about these citational works, and I feel like when I was making that book or playing with that vocabulary, because I didn't make the term literary supercut, but with the idea of like citational, that was just a term I kind of, tried to sculpt together.
I like it, by the way.
Oh, thanks. But anyway, so this text is strange because it's really hard to pin down. It's not a novel. It's not a poem. It doesn't really fall under the rubric of what I've described because it's not really quotations. It's like this author surely researched a lot, but it's kind of summaries of research and even it gets pretty poetic. Like, in the excerpt I read, it talks about a building, a concert hall burning down. And then it just so happens that Samuel Beckett was there that day.
Those. Yeah.
But, and of course, like that becomes its own mini narrative. I mean, so on one hand, I just love that this book is hard to categorize, but also like, yeah, situating it, it seems like connected to David Markson's work, although
Mm-hmm.
I am not convinced that Lefebvre was aware of that, because I looked at the timing of things, and that like quartet, that tetralogy of where it's like really just lists,
Mm-hmm.
it kind of was simultaneous. And he was doing this in 2001. I don't know. Either way, it's a different approach in that this has like, there's really no narrative. Like there's no, like, whereas in Markson, there's...
There is a person, there is the author, there is the reader, there is, that exists. But in Lefebvre, it's nothing. It is the list.
Right. But then you can, of course, as you were alluding to, like, there are these references to these Henris, Henri Lefebvre's. At the end, there's an Henri waiter. So there's definitely some like tongue-in-cheek self-referentiality here. But I'm interested in this text because it also reminds me a little bit of Félix Fénéon's like 3-line novels, where he took like newspaper stories and wrote them into these condensed like 3-line stories, or like the falsely attributed Hemingway story, like For Sale, Baby Shoes Never Worn.
Right.
Like one of the reasons why I love this is that so many of these feel like mini novels or something. Like there's a instance where it's about like the lost, that there's like one diary of Sylvia Plath that exists, and then another that Ted Hughes burnt. And like the image of him burning, what was in there, what was written, what was documented, like that's a whole novel right there. Mm-hmm. And, or the love letters between Rimbaud and Verlaine, like, I don't know, just, and it makes me think that in those kind of just snippet moments that, we because we don't have it, it like lets our imagination run wild. And I just think that's one of the reasons why I love this book. The other thing, this is less like situating it, but just one of the reasons why I love it is it seems to me that like if I were to teach in an MFA program or something, this would be required reading. This and this book Two After That by Renee Gladman, I think are like one of the most important texts for writers to read. Of course. So this being the missing pieces, the reason I think it's so important is that if you're in an MFA program, which I did do, you're kind of taught to crank out writing like a machine or something. You have these deadlines and there's this kind of anxiety of producing. But one of the things that you realize maybe 10 pages into this book is that so much of writing is like years where somebody didn't write, or a project that failed, or a project that was lost. And so, I don't know, one of my takeaways is that part of writing is not writing. I don't know, there's people talk about, I write 500 words a day. When I'm writing an actual book, I might do that, but sometimes, I need a break, or, and actually the writing gets better if I like take a break, or.
Yeah, there's almost like what's captured in this book is the outside world as it relates to the work of art, and how honestly statistically unlikely it is to create art in the first place, but that also to have it exist versus the downward decay of the outside world and time, whether it's something burning down or somebody, Gogol burning the manuscripts to the second and third books of Dead Souls, or whether it's, a thing that simply never got funded, right? Like all of these types of outside parameters influence it. So it's not just that you need to sit down and write your 500 words every single day and therefore you will have your great American novel. It's that you actually have to be sort of lucky to traverse through the gauntlet of these likely adversaries in terms of outside world items. So
yeah,
I was just impressed that we have anything left at all, quite frankly, after reading this book.
Yeah, fortunately we do have some things. But no, seriously, there's that moment about Melville and the warehouse burning towards the end of his life, and like he was not very popular. That was devastating, I thought. I mean, I knew that he ended life like not in a good place and unknown, but just to also end life like out of print and like of course, we all know how the story then goes later, but yeah, it's bleak. But so I guess actually the first time I read it, I did not feel like it was bleak. I was just like amazed and had this kind of like, this is great for MFA students or whatever. Second time I was like, this is depressing. This time I, just because I knew we were talking, I looked at it more of like a researcher or something. And actually, speaking about that, I made this list for the people at home who might have not read it. This might make you more interested, or I just thought it was interesting to kind of catalog exactly, well, not exactly what's going on here, but, you know, it's called The Missing Pieces, but it's not just about missing works. So I made a list of like basically all the verbs used to describe like what has happened to these works. The most common is burning, as you mentioned. Like, I just feel like half of the book is like, who knew that, I guess before computers, people would just burn their manuscripts a lot.
Probably safer than deleting your hard drive, I think.
Yeah. But there's also these missing pieces they're burnt, they've been flooded, they're incomplete or abandoned or unfinished, missing or lost, ignored or forgotten today, lacking attribution, never begun, stolen, written but never performed or published, dismantled as in a sculpture, eaten by a dog as in some of the TypeScript of On the Road, destroyed while being restored, not performed or published during the creator's lifetime, washed off, self-destructed, dispersed, chopped up, torn up, trashed, bulldozed, plundered, rejected, erased, cut up, melted, thrown in a toilet and then set on fire, confiscated, suppressed, modified, published without the author's name, and then rolled up into cigarettes and smoked by the Red Guard. That was one half of my archival work. And then the other half, or just like research work on this, was that I would usually in a one sentence description say this is all about missing works of art and like philosophy, but it's also about this list. So it's also about missing or destroyed and all these things. Lives, hair, pregnancies, sight, love letters, the ability to perceive music, the foundation of all literatures, Tintin's bedroom, houses, the memory of writing a work, as in Naked Lunch, sex scenes, the bathtub Jim Morrison died in, concert halls, libraries, languages, particularly Cumbrian, nameless people, psychoanalysis notes, birth dates, the name of the person who ran over Roland Barthes. It was a hit and run, I think. Years not writing, what Marquis de Sade looked like, the assassin of Christopher Marlowe, signs of madness, anonymous artist names, college courses, a name on a tomb, tombs themselves, theses, voices, orthography, syntax, the identity of a person who inspired a character, family china, which I read about, Goethe smashing, an island, libraries, concert halls, uppercase letters, S in the plural, R in the infinitive, the ability to speak, and the head of Petrarch. So I went through, that might be exhaustive, because I was trying to find instances where it's not about like art.
Yeah. So that fits in well with essentially two of my favorite moments, or at least the things that stuck out to me as both poetic in his phrasing, but also references that I instantly identified with. And so I'll tag on to your list. And the very end of the book, he references The Lost Generation and the Honor of Katharina Blum, which is a reference to Heinrich Boll's The Lost Honor of Katharina Blum. So implying that the honor is what is lost. So he does this thing where sometimes he'll say in more or less a full sentence what is missing or is lost or is destroyed. But then he'll imply it. And when he does that in an indirect way, I feel like it kind of pops more, because it makes you think, wait, what is this list actually about? That he's just implying it there. And then perhaps the one that's a bit more emotional is, after a somewhat long entry, there's just a very short one that says the pregnancies of Frida Kahlo. End. Yeah. And so, if you look up, she had difficulties with terminations and miscarriages. And so you're sort of left with these, what is that, 5 words?
Right.
That can, like, as you alluded to earlier, is a whole novel. It is a whole story and can give you that same impact. And so when you play that with the fact that this is about art, but there are many entries that actually have nothing to do with art at all, it's just human.
Right.
Makes you sort of realize that it's hard out there, right? As an artist or as a human who is an artist, right? There's just this kind of downward force of life that is a challenge.
Right.
And so he captures that in a way that doesn't really have a true narrator, doesn't really have a true character, but you're still left with some of that emotion. And that, I think, is just very cool to be experienced as a reader.
Yeah. I guess one maybe nice thing for these characters in this book, if you want to call them that, the real life people, is that although they have this loss, they're also like now eternal. Or like, you know, the fact that like there was no entry for all the manuscripts from MFA students that will never be published.
Yeah, right.
You know, like that could be one. And that they're in here because we know them. Although I should say, admittedly, I did not know a good chunk of these people. It's very French-centric, like Eurocentric. Although I noticed that it gets a bit less Eurocentric as it goes along. I wonder if it was written chronologically and Lefebvre was like, we need to do more than just the West here.
Or maybe he was running out.
Yeah. And actually, it makes it, like, looking at this again, it made me think like that it would be really, I don't know if anybody would want to do this, but if somebody were to continue the project from a different cultural perspective, there obviously is much more to catalog here, you know. And I even noticed, I was like, if I were to add one to this text, I saw that John Keene's counter narratives book was, he lost like an early draft was deleted in Microsoft Word. So if I were to contribute one, I would say that sounds devastating. Although his book ended up being like he pushed through, and I think it's an incredible book.
That's very similar to William Gass's. We did a podcast on this book. Why can I not pull it out? Anyway, one of his novels was basically stolen from a desk drawer when he was a professor at a university, and set off this whole thing, and then he had to go rewrite it. And so then the question is it better? Is it the same novel? Is it different?
Yeah.
Like, we can truly never know.
Yeah. So I guess as a writer myself, I would say the hope would be that it is better. Yeah, of course. But I don't know. I also wonder if it is always better. I just feel like time and like marinating in ideas, I just feel like, who knows?
I mean, I will say, to break whatever wall, this podcast, every once in a long while, and hopefully this is not one of these episodes, does have a recording issue where we talk for like an hour and then it didn't take due to whatever technical problem. Yeah. We always re-record it. And there is this question of what was that original conversation that is not documented? And is the new one better? And sometimes I do feel like it is a little better because we've practiced. But at the same time, you're like, was there that spontaneity that didn't get captured? And so like that's I'm leaning into this a little bit, but that was a thing that came up as I was reading the missing pieces. I was like, this feels a little bit like what we're already doing right now.
Yeah. I mean, so you guys, this podcast and those lost recordings will be in the next edition. Should be in the next edition of this book.
I mean, we have a small listener base. Something tells me that would be an even smaller listener base.
I guess I'm actually surprised at how well this book did. I saw there were reviews in LA Times and like Harper's and stuff, but there's also probably a pretty small reader base for this book, relatively. But no, it's a good point. It probably, it would be hard to say that all times doing something again are better. I actually remember being at a concert when I was still living in San Francisco, the Other Minds New Music Festival, and there was this kind of, there was this improvisatory piece that I knew that they had practiced together beforehand, and I remember watching and thinking, I feel like it would have been better if they had not practiced earlier. So I wondered if the original one was better than the live one. But
it's like a comedian who does 2 sets in a night. Is the second one better? Is it worse? Does it just feel rehashed?
Yeah.
Who knows? But speaking of reader bases and listening bases, we should talk about your book.
Oh, yeah.
With perhaps the hope of expanding that. So, your book, coming out shortly, The Nature Book. I'll actually hand off to you in terms of, you mentioned earlier in the episode what your great idea was, or this is the best idea that you had, so you're rolling with it. So can you describe what that idea is in this book?
Yeah. So basically, the book is a literary supercut and a novel made entirely out of nature descriptions from 300 other novels. So the idea was to, draw from a certain material, novels, and then rearrange it in the form that I was drawing it, the form of the thing I'm drawing from, novel. That idea was actually drawn from somebody else, from this friend of mine, Kota Izawa. He had asked me, this is back in 2012, he asked me to give a reading at an artist talk of his at the Center for the Book in San Francisco. And at the time, I would always write something new for each reading. And I was used to responding to artworks and trying to transpose methods from art into writing. And he had made this video called City of Nature, where he took nature shots from feature-length movies and rotoscoped them. So he traced over them, kind of like if you've seen A Scanner Darkly. Mm-hmm. But it looks more like South Park. It's flat, but not like South Park. The animals look like you just traced over an animal. Dude didn't make it look like a inflated dog or something. And it kind of, and it moves really slowly and thematically. The rivers of Fitzcarraldo cut to the rivers of Deliverance, which cut to the rivers of Rambo, which flow to the sea of Jaws and swept away. And I saw this, and most of his work before then was about depictions of violence in American culture. And this, of course, was not that. It was just the only sign of danger is a shark fin poking above the water. And also his rotoscoping kind of made the nature look very abstract. And I was like, there's something going on here, about the strangeness and maybe and the problems of framing life and flattening it. And so I thought, well, what would happen if I did something similar with nature descriptions in novels, which seemed a kind of corollary to nature shots in movies. And then halfway through writing this short piece, I thought, oh God, it's not done. It can't just be a short piece. It needs to be a whole novel made out of nature descriptions. And it took me a while to figure out the rhythm, because I liked how Kota's work was a kind of well paced. It wasn't a really rapid jump cut, super cut. Things really flowed together. And so it took me 4 years to figure out how to get that rhythm, and even just to figure out how to write a novel, because at the time I was a poet. Really, it took me longer than that to learn how to write a novel. I think maybe a draft 5 of this book, I was like, oh, right, this is how chapters work. And now I only have novel ideas. I haven't written a poem, and I don't have any ideas for them. So,
well, there's a fascinating thing I realized as I was reading, sort of 2 steps. Mm-hmm. One is that I had to train myself slightly to read more in depth about the nature scenes, because I think you've realized as a reader, or I'll speak for myself as a reader, I read those faster because I'm getting through that. And so I think there's a whole point here is that this is the story. And so realizing that in yourself as a reader, that you've actually probably been reading a lot of stuff and skipping over things just because your perception has perhaps deemed it to be less important. Which I think that was first realization. Second realization is after getting past that and getting into it, I was amazed at how not cut up it felt. And so I think that's a testament to your process and your ability to stitch that together. But I think that there's also something in there where there's a commonality of how these scenes are written across, 100 years of literature, across 300 books. And so I'm curious, because you're looking directly at the source material, how easy was it to get it to flow? Is this a thing that just fell into place? Does it require way more effort than we could possibly imagine? How did that work as you were lining it up?
Yeah. At first, it didn't start with, I wanted the rhythm to be kind of smooth and well paced, but it was more just about trying to find patterns. For instance, I noticed there are all these descriptions of trees as castles and armies, and then clouds as like an opponent army coming towards you. And so I could quickly make like a paragraph. I mean, quickly. It took some time to sort all this out, but I could make a paragraph of like basically about the war of the trees and the clouds or something, or like leaves falling. I could find the beginning of leaves falling, the middle of leaves falling, like in the season, the middle of leaves falling, the end of leaves falling. And if you just kind of get enough of those, you can kind of string them together. It is highly curated, though, in an attempt to make it readable and like, I guess, immersive. Although I do hope that people are drawn out of the text for a moment. There's these footnotes that provide commentary. They were originally just where all the present tense language went, because it's all past tense, because I had present tense language.
Interesting.
And then they kind of grew into a thing of their own, a voice of their own. But yeah, just, I was really interested in finding those commonalities, and also just that one of the reasons why it feels not like a cut up in some ways is that a lot of realist fiction, it's not all the same, obviously, but compared to Finnegan's Wake or something, which does come up, there is, if there's a spectrum, of how opaque or playful or whatever you could get, the majority of work is kind of like clustered together in like a realistic depiction of things. And so, I mean, another funny thing, this seems kind of related. I was reading the 3 Body Problem trilogy as I was writing this.
I have not read that, but every person I know has. So.
Oh yeah, it's good. It has some political problems, I think, but it definitely changed my perspective on like space and time. And actually, with this book, like thinking about what can a book do to rethink how we perceive our place in the world and be less, geocentric, human centric. But more importantly, for what we're talking about, at one point, the first line of Virginia Woolf's "The Waves" showed up. The sun had not yet risen. And of course, that line is not like on the surface so unique, but for me, who had been engaging with this text, like I knew that line, like because I looked at the waves and the sun had not yet risen. And then I went on Google and I started to search what other books have the sun had not yet risen, and there were like 50.
Was Wolf the first?
Sorry,
I said, was Wolf the first?
Ooh, I need to look back at that.
Is The Waves a supercut? And I never knew it.
But I guess it just made me think like that. Some of nature descriptions are just kind of generic. Like the bird flew past the tree, and then some, as you see in the text, are like the raging torment of followed by the gloomy funereal awfulness of the yeah. So yeah, I'm reminded also there's this remix artist who works with pop music, and she says that pop goes with pop, that it's easy to combine it because they kind of go together. And so I might say that with a lot of like work gathering language and then sorting through it, like realism can go with realism if you want to. I mean, some people might have approached this text in like writing this in a very like more cut up way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, unlike the missing pieces, which sort of drove me to look up things, I tried to resist that urge when reading the nature book. But as you mentioned, the Joyce stuff, so it's hard to read River Run and not be like, Joyce. But my absolute favorite is Beckett's Watt with the frogs croaking at different algorithmic rhythms, specifically because we have an episode on that a while ago, but we read that in a local book club and people hated it. And so like I remember like discussing all of the I think genius in it. But it really cleaned out folks in terms of what they're willing to tolerate. So when that gets dropped in, it definitely stands out on its own, even if you haven't read Watt. But I love that you probably had this spectrum of, like you said, relatively close realist writing. And then you had these, bombs to drop or like things in your back pocket that you knew you could use because they fit the form, and you decided when to slide those in there. And so I have to imagine that was a fun like process to figure out how to line that up.
Yeah, and I wanted that. One of the maybe problems of this kind of work, if you make a video collage, you like The Clock by Christian Marclay, like we've seen many of those movies. Like or if we haven't, we know the actors. But when you use text, you'll get some people who know some of the references, like surely, there's it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Like, and I actually kind of really wanted those because between those moments where it's a very clear reference to something external and the footnotes, I was trying to, create moments where the reader is like brought back to the materiality of the text, the process, so that it wasn't just immersive and beautiful. And yeah, so I don't know if you like that as a reader, but like being pulled out, but that was my hope.
I have one more main question, and this is the thing we often ask ourselves in this podcast, and I ask myself as a reader, which is, as you're reading a text, sometimes it's very apparent who the narrator is. Other times it is very much buried or perhaps not specified whatsoever. And so in this type of text, where very clearly it's coming from many sources, do you view it as, when combined, it takes on a narrator? Or is it outside of that? What is really A, the goal, or maybe B, the result that happens with respect to who's driving this narrative?
Right. On one hand, I don't want to respond to who the narrator is, just because I feel like it's kind of one of the mysteries of the text. And I guess I should say, it's something that I didn't really think about too much. Using so many constraints, I feel like literary constraints, with regards to sentence level questions, I feel like I was able to trick myself into ignoring certain things. I mean, but if we're going to speak literally, the voice is it's a multivocal chorus that somehow feels unified. But yeah, I mean, there are these questions, where are we? When are we? When is this taking place? Is it thousands of years after humans did some alien come and, observe? But of course, then that doesn't even, kind of work because the voice is so highly affected. And in a way, it feels just to me like it is just a hybrid, that it is, it's like a text speaking, not even a person, but also nature speaking, and just this, it's just this hybrid human nature voice that I think is, that I don't want to pin down particularly as the writer. But that's, I guess, when I think about materially and how it's all working, I'm curious about that. And I'm curious to hear what other people find. Yeah, maybe that's not satisfying, but
No. I mean, well, first off, ambiguity is what makes art great, right? If you told me who it was, you'd be like, oh yeah, it's this one person. I mean, first off, I wouldn't totally believe you based on this text. Yeah, but secondly, it's more of an open question, because I think a layer to this is that I went into it, and based on your afterword, it sounds like you kind of went into it in a similar fashion with the expectation that it would be truly devoid of anything human. But what you find, I'll speak for my side as a reader, that you see that it's very hard to describe nature without using similes that invoke human things. I mean, there's references to, it was beautiful like a photograph. Or I think I wrote down that there was a reference to cocaine once, and paper mache, and stuff like that. And so you sort of realize that humans, as an attempt to be writing about something that is not human, cannot entirely divorce it from themselves. So there's a certain level of solipsism there of, does this even exist without us? And of course that makes sense because a human wrote these things, but you can't truly extract it as much as you try. And I think that was, one of the fascinating realizations that came along with it, which is, to what extent am I just projecting everything about myself onto something? This being an example, but surely you can extrapolate that to many other examples in your life. And so I like that as kind of a self-awareness of how much am I sort of pre-filtering everything to fit what I expect. And so I thought that was a very cool takeaway from walking through this. Yeah.
I didn't think this initially, but halfway through, I was like, this text is just polluted with people and human references. But yeah, in an earlier version, I did try to strip the human completely from the text, which of course is impossible because it's language, and alphabetical language is a human construction. But even like words like bank, like a river bank, I wouldn't include, because a reader could be like, in some distant way that there are these financial institutions. It was ridiculous, and it wasn't even a good text. And after I thought about it more, I realized that the reason why it was also just not a good idea was that the thing that's interesting about nature descriptions, what you were saying, like that it's about people, like it's about our perspective. And of course, as you were referring to, like, there's maybe a problem in that. I've wondered, I feel like the jury's still out, but I'm curious, as I've been writing this book, I wonder, is there something wrong with us? or is there something about the fact that when we behold something like nature, that we have to see ourselves in it, that is like a kind of fatal flaw, and related to like why we can't tackle climate change. At the same time, I've read a lot about how can we actually, tackle this and get into this. And it does seem that for people to get excited, interested about fixing things, that it kind of needs to be about people. So I don't know. I do feel like we're trapped in a little bit of a loop.
Yeah. And, I always kind of attribute a thing of a novel that I like tends to be one that invokes an emotional response. And somewhat surprisingly, I did find that in this as well. I mean that in that I was not going into it expecting it. I think the main piece of it is the mule, right? In its, independent journey across the desert. And I just watched Jerzy Skolimowski's EO. I don't know if you've seen his latest film, but like the connection there is very good in that, it's not exactly the same. So there's lots of humans in EO, but it is this question of making the main character an animal, and all of the human stuff around it becomes irrelevant. Lots of fragmented storylines, but also there is an attempt by the director, I think, to ride the line between how much of human emotions are attributed to the animal itself. And you see this sometimes, but you also realize sometimes that it is just an animal kind of going about life with its, sensory inputs and just trying to figure out what is best and not really making the same types of decisions that perhaps a human might make. And so I found a lot of commonality between that movie and that section of the book, and both honestly very emotionally moving. And so this question we keep cycling on is like, to what extent can nature exist without humans, and to what extent can humans approach and describe nature without their humanness? I think has way more layers than I ever expected. And so this has tipped me off on a category of thinking that I think is very fascinating, because it's lazy, I think, to just say, oh, well, we should care about them in exactly the same way, because they are not humans, I guess they being animals in this specific case. But what is the right amount? How much do they know? And I don't necessarily mean this from the politics of, veganism and stuff like that. I just mean it as an interesting question that I honestly just don't know the answer to. And I think maybe not everyone does either. And so I'm appreciative of that train of thought and how much I've gotten to kind of explore that with both that film and your book that pair very well together.
Yeah. Another similar thing I've noticed is that, when I, like, having written this book where there supposedly no people, of course, who's this voice? It hasn't ruined books for me. I still am reading a lot of books, but just like in comparison, like every book is just about people. Like that's how even it's like everything's just a mirror.
You're like someone coming out of the woods after a year.
Yeah,
just, like,
right.
overwhelmed.
Basically, no, but I mean, I also, in a way, it actually also kind of ruined poetry for me, because trying to write a book that was so smooth and like no jump cuts, like so much poetry moves at like relatively lightning speed, like cutting between things. It's not ruined it, but I feel like just another instance of, are there other ways? Obviously there are other people doing different things, but just I'm interested in variations on, common patterns in how we do things. But yeah. But I don't know. It's interesting. Like every book is about.
It's about us.
And I guess, as I say that, I'm like, well, what else would they be about?
Yeah. Right. But, what is the alternative?
But
who knows?
Of course this is not totally true. Science books and surely there's philosophy that's thinking about that. But basically getting back to like the Cixin Liu, like the 3-body problem, and maybe a book like this, the hope would be that for a moment we all get a chance to maybe engage with a different perspective that is like at least pushing against that. If not, hopefully offering something slightly different.
Yes, and that is what I think is a proper summary and wrap-up point.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for first off the book, the recommendation of the missing pieces, basically the starting point of this thought trajectory that I've been on and probably will be on for a while. So thank you for all of your time and insights. It's really been a pleasure.
Yeah, and thank you for having me. I love this podcast.
Thanks for listening. You can find out more about us at booksofsomesubstance.com and on Twitter and Instagram with the handle booksosubstance. You can find out more about Tom Comitta at, you guessed it, tomcomitta.com. That's TOMCOMITTA.com. Their new book is available on Coffee House Press, and if you couldn't tell from the episode, it's something that has made me consider literature with a capital L in a new light, which is my way of saying, just go grab a copy. And just a reminder, please click like buttons and subscribe buttons and write reviews. Every little bit helps. And every so often, we'll read a review out loud, like this one from either Lambic12345 or Iambic12345. It's hard to tell since lowercase l's look like capital I's, Anyway, so they write a review with the title Panine, and it goes, "Such a superficial reading of this unique book. How proud these boys are of disliking Nabokov. It's quite embarrassing. Whew, tough crowd. I'd also note that we're all big fans of Nabokov, so not totally sure what happened there. Either way, thanks for giving us a chance, Lambic/Iambic12345. And if you're listening, you should check out our other episode on Nabokov. That one was Invitation to a Beheading. If I remember correctly, these boys like that one a lot. Until next time, happy reading. Whew.